Hello and welcome to this lecture on Adobe Photoshop by Eduonics. In this lecture, we're going to be going into shapes. Start off by creating a new document. Choose something, it doesn't really matter. You can put in anything, you can change it later if you want. But choose something that corresponds to web. It's a good idea to put transparent for background contents, because you don't have to worry about that pesky locked layer. And the name, probably the most useful thing is just the name. So anyway, that's usually where I like to start, is with a transparent background. But as far as entering the name with a new document, put in a name so that way you don't have to type it in when you're saving. I guess it's not really that important. But now if you have Illustrator and you know how to use it, use Illustrator to create your shapes and just drag them into Photoshop. It's way more suited to use one program for what it's for. Use Photoshop for what it's for. Use Illustrator for what it's for. But for this tutorial, we're going to be showing how to do it in Photoshop, because a lot of you will prefer to do it in Photoshop. Down there above the magnifying glass, you'll see the Shapes tool. It's a little square. If you don't see a square, just hold it in. Now go up to Window and down to Paths. Select that if you don't already have it open, and drag it after it opens so that it doesn't auto-collapse if you have auto-collapse on. When you see it's attached to the icon, it just means the icon will suck it back up as soon as you click off of it. I like to keep things up. So clicking on icons are really small. It's nice to have the panel remain open but not turning off auto collapse. It's also a useful feature. Best of both worlds. Now if you go down to the shapes and you hold in the mouse button, you'll see all the different shape tools you can use. We're only going to be going into a few of these. Excuse me. Let's take a look at Custom Shape tool. I'll show you later in this video how to choose which custom shape. By default, I believe it's this arrow. And as you can see, there's anchor points and everything if you're used to Illustrator. It's just like Illustrator in a lot of ways, especially if you're using CC. They've made a lot of, well, I wouldn't call them improvements because I don't think Photoshop should be doing vector, but now I duplicated these layers to get two new shapes. That's why I dragged the two off. It's because when you duplicate a layer, it puts it right on top. No real reason, just as you can see, all the layers are smart objects. You can tell by the little icon in the lower right hand corner of the thumbnail in the layers panel. Now in CC, like I was talking about earlier, you can edit these anchor points directly, and very similar to the way you would do it in Illustrator. And I'm using the direct selection tool down here, or you can hit Shift A or just A depending on what's available. Shift A will cycle through all the different tools that you get for A. So if you have the regular selection tool, then you would hit Shift A and you would get the direct selection tool. Hit Shift A again, you get the regular selection tool back. It's basically the same as far as the shortcuts you'd hit Control Alt Shift or Command Option Shift if you're trendy on a Mac. it's relatively the same. After you've held in your modifier keys like Control or Shift and Command, and then you've made your selection, you release the keys, you release your mouse. Your transform thing is still up, and you can continue to make selections, so you don't have to keep exiting transform and then re-entering it. Play around with it and you'll notice. So if you select this and you go up to the control panel, which is the little strip at the top that tells you basically what I've taken this window down from, little strip at the top with all the options, you can customize this, and I encourage you to use the top strip, the options or control, whatever you want to call it. You can select colors. Even though it's a symbol, you can change the colors. You can change just about anything, because once you lay it down, it's in vector form. And I should say that these aren't smart objects, I don't think. I think they're just vector objects, which is virtually the same thing. The control panel is your friend, though. Learn it. If you notice that when you select it on a canvas, or on the layers panel, it will draw a thin line around the individual shape. And all shapes are on their own little layer, so it's really helpful to be able to just highlight a layer. And as you can see, it puts a little thin line around it. That's not necessarily just the path. I believe if holding Control or Command on a Mac and hovering over the layer will supposedly do the same thing, although I haven't had any success with it. And if you're here, they put basically the most important properties, so always look up into your commands rather than opening the individual panels. And if it's not up, or I'm sorry, not commands, but in Control in the options bar. So I'm doing all this from the options bar as opposed to from the stroke or paths panel. Now I'm showing you the dotted line options. And you can see all the other options, align and caps, corners. It basically, what the little image looks like is what it determines. So, but with dashed lines, here we have 4 to 11, 5, 23 dash, and 11 gap. And you can see it. And then it restarts at 4 right there. You see how it goes and goes, and then it repeats. So it's all the same functionality as Illustrator. Although I still recommend using Illustrator if you have the option. So if you go into paths, which is what I told you to do earlier, you can see shapes, and it pretty much acts like a normal thumbnail icon that would appear in the layers panel, that would appear in the history. You can control click the thumbnail to get the selection. You can double click it to get different options. Now these buttons down here at the bottom, you can convert from path to selection, back and forth. But in the interest of copy fade, you typically don't want to do it too much, and I'll show you why. As you can see, the initial image doesn't have any anchor points, but when I convert back and forth from a selection back into a path, it adds anchor points. Basically it's copy fade. If you don't know what that is, look it up, or just take my word, you don't want a lot of that. Although it's generally not going to have much of an effect, but just keep in mind, use alpha channels, use save selections, but don't just rely on paths to provide you with your selections. That's the basics of what you can edit with this panel up here. It's always there and it changes depending on what tool you have. So if you go over here and hold in your mouse over it and select a rectangle tool, and you drag it out, and I'm holding in shift, as you probably guessed, makes all the sides equal regardless of where my mouse is. and you can't tell it right now, but there's a little icon that, or a little box that pops up to the upper right of my cursor, and it will on yours too, that tells you the dimensions as you're dragging it. So if you open the Properties panel, which if you can't see it's located under Window like all the other panels, you can see all the choices that's also in the Options bar up here. So real handy stuff here. It kind of groups everything together so you don't have to go to another place. And most of the stuff is self-explanatory, but anyway, it's creating my shape in the same style as the other ones I just created. So if you had just created one with all these properties and you wanted to create another with all the properties, just go ahead and do it and it'll automatically have them. So let's just take a look back at the custom shapes. When I have custom shapes selected, I have a bunch of shapes to choose from up here. If I hold it down, you can see all the different default custom shapes, and that little gear icon in the upper right, I can choose more custom shapes. At the very bottom, it gives me all these options of libraries. Now I just changed the size of my thumbnails. It's always an option in your upper right hand corner of each panel, as long as the panel has options. So most of these options are self-explanatory: load shapes, save shapes. But down here is all your different libraries, and you can install more libraries by going to your Photoshop and your program files, depending on if you're Mac or PC. You can look it up and it'll tell you where to save them. But now I selected speech balloons and I chose replace as opposed to append, because append will add speech balloons to my existing library. So you can drag these out, and it's basically like you have a have a shape in transform mode as soon as you drag it out, and then once you've transformed it, it converts it to vector. You can pretty much do whatever you want with it, as you see here, and it has all the points and everything. Still, I do recommend using Illustrator if you have that option, because Illustrator is always going to be more geared towards vector than anything else, because that's what Illustrator is. Photoshop is for photo manipulation, and you know, the more you use Photoshop for photo manipulation, the less they'll change it to be the every tool. So you select everything, you go down to define custom shape, and as soon as you do that, you'll see it in your drop down. You would go to Preset Manager and you would save this to actually have it in your drop downs for the future, because once you exit Photoshop and re-enter Photoshop, it's not going to be in there. So you notice that it's all grayed out. You have to actually select those little icons first. It's like here, I'm going to hit this shape we just created on the far right, and then hold in Shift and then hit the one on the far left. You'll select everything, and then I would hit save. As for ellipse and polygon, those are pretty self-explanatory, and that does it for the introduction to shapes. So thanks for watching.